that are just joining, if you do have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to log them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will take questions from the audience at the end of the presentation. We will begin in 1 minute. Thank you for joining us today.
A healthy, growing Colorado, built on a solid foundation. Data, bigger than bias, using time-tested analytical tools to give citizens the facts. We are CSI, the Common Sense Institute, and our mission is to examine the fiscal impacts of policies and initiatives so that the laws that impact our lives allow individual opportunity to flourish, not skewed or bent by politics or partisanship. Our team includes some of the best and brightest policy minds in Colorado, and our board of directors from every corner of our state encompass Colorado's vital industries. We are committed to the protection and promotion of Colorado's economy, because in our opinion, that's just common sense. We are the Common Sense Institute.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this exciting webinar that's been about a year in the process in the making. Today we're going to be discussing a path forward, a common sense strategy for the continued viability of Colorado's transportation network. My name is Kristen Strom. I serve as the president and CEO of Common Sense Institute. If you have any questions throughout this program, please feel free to log them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will save time, about 15 minutes at the end of the program, to answer questions from any of you in the audience. I'd like to just start off. You might not all be familiar with Common Sense Institute and what we do. We are a nonprofit research institute that focuses on the fiscal policies and implications of the big public policy issues that matter most to you. We believe that sound fiscal and economic research is essential to uphold Colorado's economy, vitality, future, and individual opportunity. One of our founding board members, Terry J. Stevinson, started a fellowship last year. It was really Terry's vision that inspired this project today. The fellowship is awarded to 2 individuals who might have different backgrounds, different perspectives on huge public policy issues facing the state of Colorado. Today and in 2020, the transportation was selected as the issue that we'll discuss. Thank you so much to Terry Stevinson for endowing this fellowship. It's my pleasure to introduce the 2 Terry J. Stevinson Fellows who have been working on this project for quite some time. First, I'd like to introduce Ben Stein. Ben served as the budget director and CFO for Cdot for the better part of a decade, and as the deputy state treasurer for another 8 years. In 2014, Ben retired from Cdot and became the chief of staff to Representative Mike Kaufman until 2019. He continues to work in the transportation field as a consultant today. The other fellow that I'd like to introduce is Henry Sobinay. His career in economics, budgeting, and finance has spanned over 25 years. And in Colorado, I think he's known as the go-to for any issues related to the state budget or TABOR. He worked for the Colorado Legislative Council. He served as the director of the OSPB under Governors Bill Owens and John Hickenlooper. He also served on the Colorado Transportation Commission. Currently, Henry serves as the CFO of the Colorado State University System. Welcome, both of you. I'd like now to turn it over to both Ben and Henry, who are going to lead us through a few of the key findings from this project. As I mentioned, feel free to log any questions that you have in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you so much for all your hard work on this project.
Thank you. Ben, I think you're muted.
You're right. I forgot to turn off my mute. Thank you. All right. Okay. Good morning, and thank you all for being here today, and particularly thanks to Kristen and to the Common Sense Institute for the opportunity that we've had to do this. This is a great opportunity for us. We've really enjoyed doing it, and we look forward to presenting to everybody. So let me just start by saying the good news is that Colorado is a growing and thriving state. The bad news for our transportation system is Colorado is a growing and thriving state. We are building, having more and more people come, more and more activity on a system that is not growing. And the net result is we have a surface transportation system in this state that is under tremendous pressure. It is deteriorating because we have constantly increasing use. The capacity that we have is finite and not growing in any meaningful way, and dwindling resources to pay, to maintain, and sustain, maintain, or improve the system. Next slide, please. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, next slide, great. So to illustrate this point, you can see here, this is a slide from Cdot, growth in demand versus capacity for surface transportation in Colorado. And this is, of course, the highway system, the road system. As you can see, since 2001, vehicle miles traveled in this state have grown by 25%, while capacity has grown by just 2%. This is a significant issue because in Colorado, we are growing, have a growing economy for a number of reasons, one of which is the quality of life. And if you are sitting in congestion or you can't get to where you need to go, the quality of life deteriorates, and with that, much of the appeal of Colorado. So this is a critical economic and quality of life issue for Colorado. Next slide, Henry.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Ben. So there's a lot of ways to look at just the financial side of the equation as opposed to just the physical capacity of the transportation system. Many of you know that the main financing mechanism is the per gallon gasoline tax, and it hasn't been adjusted since 1991. And since that time, we've seen construction inflation grow faster than regular inflation. And we've also seen massive increases in fuel efficiency in cars. So we can have more use of the system, but the underlying mechanism to pay for it doesn't keep up. So there's lots of ways to look at that. And we chose this one. This is fiscal year '04 collections in the Highway Users Tax Fund. That's where the gasoline tax and registration fees go to CDOT. And then we took a look at just population growth and then a national construction cost index compiled by the Federal Department of Transportation. And what if fiscal year '04 collections had kept up with that combined growth of people and costs of construction? And you can see the fuel efficiency impact happening over time, especially, and also the inability of the underlying revenue stream to keep up with inflation. And so those gaps compound every year. And by the end, you know, under this theoretical what if, this would have been $644 million more dollars annually if we had a system that was very much tied to the underlying costs to keep it up. So next slide. So what do you do about it, especially in a pandemic and what we know right now is a recession? We had much of the paper done prior to COVID-19 breaking out and the lockdowns and so forth. And it became clear that understanding the impact of the pandemic and the recession would make a better paper. And so we've kind of broken up the path forward into 3 phases. phase one is basically stabilization and find the bottom and understand where we are. And there's a few dimensions to this. Number one, we've seen dramatic changes in travel demand. Probably everyone listening today didn't drive to come hear our talk today. And we just don't know how long that situation will last and to what extent. It certainly feels today that there's some permanent change in maybe driving to work patterns. But we also see other changes that affect transportation where perhaps there's way more reliance on deliveries to receive goods and services. So that changes kind of business use of highways versus people. Then we're in a recession, and so the underlying revenue available to transportation is under pressure, and we don't understand that. So we feel that understanding those impacts, plus and minus, as well as finishing up the last two phases of the Senate Bill 267 COPs, those will be done in fiscal year 23. There's probably a meaningful chunk of time to understand all of this and then see what people think about the next two phases. Ben, you want to take over from here for phase two and the underlying maintenance issue?
Sure. So for phase two,
Ben, we're still getting a little bit of feedback. Could you move your microphone down just a little bit?
okay, is that any better?
That helps. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, so for phase two, the thought is you've got to take the most efficient and effective way to take care of the system is to first and foremost take care of what you have. We've already built it. Maintaining infrastructure you've already built is always less expensive and more economical than building new infrastructure. Or even worse, letting your infrastructure that exists now become so deteriorated that instead of maintaining it, you end up paying to replace it. That is very expensive. And so the goal for funding in phase two is to maintain what we have. And for that, we've calculated that we need about $300 million additional dollars per year for Cdot. And if you use the traditional method of sharing of highway user tax fund money for the state, which is where approximately 60% goes to Cdot and 40% goes to the municipalities and counties, you need about $500 million a year. It's important to note that the cities and counties maintain a very large road network in this state as well. And they've been relying upon those resources for a long time. Now, the question becomes, of course, how do you pay for it? And we've listed a number of options. We're not picking a specific option. We're presenting the options to give you an idea of what the magnitude is and what it would cost. As you can see, just using on the state side, if you only did the state system, it would be about a 0.24% increase in the sales tax, a 0.15% increase in the income tax. Vehicle registration fees, if you did it with that, would increase $51, basically $52 a piece. An important one we've brought in here that is not a currently used mechanism for raising revenue in the state would be to transition to a vehicle miles traveled fee per mile. It would be, as you can see, that's not a very large fee. If we go to a vehicle miles traveled fee, this is the additional increment based upon assuming you'd already have switched your other collection system for vehicle miles traveled. It would be between 1 and 2 cents per mile plus this amount. And then finally, the additional fuel tax you'd be paying would be about 10 cents a gallon. When you consider that motor fuel right now is what, maybe $2.50 a gallon, another 10 cents when we used to be paying almost $4 a gallon is a possibility. But there are issues with motor fuel tax as we become more fuel efficient and as more and more vehicles are powered by electricity. So to the next slide, Henry, do you want to talk about phase three?
Sure. So phase one was take stock of where we are. Phase two is address the maintenance gap. But as Ben alluded to in the opening comments, Colorado has a capacity gap. The system just hasn't kept up with population growth. It was designed many decades ago for population numbers that we passed a long time ago. And that's one of the underlying issues with our congestion. So those of you probably attending today have heard for many years now the $9 billion shortfall in capacity that's been debated. The hospital provider fee bill from a few years ago addressed about just shy of $2 billion of that number. And then in the last year, Cdot has gone around to the state and done what I would call, this is my language, a re-stakeholdering process around what projects would different planning regions prioritize. And they've come up with a next phase of that $9 billion, and it adds up to about $3.2 billion. And their plan would be to finish it from 2024 to 2030. But right now, under current law, either federal or state law, that list is unfunded. But it's in our report, and you can go see just the list, but also the presentation of the full stakeholdering is available from Cdot. If you did that as a pay-as-you-go option, it would be $533 million a year, and the similar incremental costs to the different financing mechanisms you can see there in the middle column. But if you did a bonding for that, it would be about $236 million a year for 20 years. We assumed around 4% there just to be safe. It's probably a little cheaper than that right now. But the reason we have phase 3 is we have a pretty significant maintenance gap just to keep what we have in the condition that we have it in. But if we want to expand our system, this would be the incremental cost on top of the slide you just saw. So next would be, what if you did everything? We spared you the trouble of having to add everything up. What's interesting about this is portions of the $3.2 billion plan actually rehabilitate some of the system. And so that $300 million could be discounted. And based on the project list and understanding what would get fixed, we assumed maybe 15% off that $300 million. So 85% of the $300 million plus the bonding is what you see on the far right 2 columns, including the version that would serve counties and cities. I'll kick it over to Ben because there's an interesting section of the paper that deals with future technologies and how that might affect our planning or our efficiency of getting around.
Yes. So as I was going through this, and doing the research to write this paper, I came across a quote that other people have heard before that's attributed to Henry Ford. When horses were the mode of transportation in the world, Henry Ford was asked, well, when you developed the mass-produced car, did you get the idea of that from talking to people? And his answer was no. If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And the point of that is, people tend to think in the paradigm of where we are today, not the paradigm of where we're going. The shift from a horse-powered economy to one powered by steam and then by internal combustion engines caused dramatic changes in our economy, our society, and everything else. We're now leaving the industrial age and moving, I would argue, into the information age. And as a result, I believe that there's a distinct possibility that a transition, not maybe as dramatic as from horse to car, but significantly dramatic from the existing types of cars we have today and the trucks and road system, will occur. And I believe that the current engineering of the transportation infrastructure may not support the system of the future. A quick example, if we switch over completely to transportation as a service, which is a possibility, people would no longer own cars, and cars would just show up something along the lines of Lyft or Uber, only probably with autonomous driving. You probably don't need parking lots at the shopping mall anymore. That's just one example of a change. So there are a lot of things coming that are going to change the system, not only because of changes in modes of transportation and how transportation works, but also because they're going to affect how the transportation revenue system based upon the motor fuel tax and registration is currently set up. Even as we're building phase 3, because we need that because these changes are not going to take place overnight. They're going to take place over 10 to 20 years. So we have to have a system to keep the economy and the quality of life going today, while at the same time thinking as we build it, what are the implications for the future, and keeping this infrastructure in a position where it will serve in those later purposes as well. Key elements, and we mentioned all of these in the paper that are in fact impacting this, and Henry mentioned this one. Vehicles are more fuel efficient and emit fewer emissions. Those are good things, but fuel efficiency, of course, means less transportation revenue. Smart technologies, both in vehicles and infrastructure. We've heard a lot about autonomous vehicles, but the future is probably going to be something more akin to connected vehicles, where the vehicles are not only have intelligence themselves and are able to drive themselves, but they're talking to the system as well and to other cars around them. Theoretically, if this were to a completely connected system, we would no longer need traffic lights as an example, because the cars would talk to each other, talk to the intersection, and they would automatically cue themselves to go through, dramatically increasing flow rates, but also completely changing intersection design. Ride sharing. Ride sharing, as we've seen with Uber and Lyft, has become quite popular. What's going to happen to it in the short term because of the pandemic likely will not change it does not mean it will not grow in the future. And ride sharing, especially becomes transportation as a service, and people no longer or rarely own their own cars, could make an enormous difference. And of course, delivery services and freight may see significant changes as well as we go to more and more home delivery and less possibly going to shopping centers and retail. And then, of course, people have never accused me of having a good imagination, and that's probably for good reason. And the result of that is, I'm sure there are people out there who have good imaginations and technical degrees who are out there dreaming up the future right now, and I can't even conceive of it. And who knows what those changes may be to change our system. So we have to keep that in the back of our mind as we try to move forward to meet with our immediate problems in the next decade or so. Henry, do you want to talk about our final thoughts?
Sure. I would just add one piece to that. Part of phase one, we make a recommendation at taking a look at the financing structure for electric cars, autonomous cars, and so forth, to make sure it's as equitable as possible, so as many users as possible are paying their fair share of the system. Our final thoughts are probably not surprising. The status quo means not very much new capacity is funded after the COP financing is over in fiscal year 23. So the current law will be back to pretty much a maintenance only budget from state and federal sources. We think the three phases align well with the current economic doldrums that we're in right now, and not understanding the trajectory of the pandemic. Once more effective treatments or a vaccine are available, I think it'll be a lot easier to understand forecasting the economy. And then this is maybe Ben and I's naivete a little bit, but we think there is a possible path forward. It's not easy, but 31 states around the country in just the last 10 years have figured out how to reform their transportation finance. Colorado, we have a little higher hurdles to clear to get that done, but we don't think a plan like this in some measure is beyond our political or civic capabilities. But it's not easy, but we're suggesting using this intervening time to keep at the problem and find an agreement.
Thank you so much for that overview, Henry and Ben. I'd now like to introduce Joey Bunch. Many of you might be familiar with Joey. He's one of the leading reporters in Colorado politics and public policy. He's well recognized and awarded. He's been on the scene for numerous years. And Joey, we're thrilled to have you this morning. He's also a fellow Alabama fan. So Roll Tide, I see the blanket in the background. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over now to Joey, who's going to lead us with our fellows in a discussion about the findings of the report. We'll do that for about 30 minutes, and then we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A from the audience. I've seen a few questions come across. Thank you for typing those in. If you do have additional questions, feel free to log them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So Joey, I'm going to now turn it over to you and Henry and Ben.
Well, thanks, everybody. I appreciate you having me. You know, this is the third or fourth time I've spoken to the Common Sense Institute, and I try to figure it out. Common sense is not something I usually get. I think I'm the before picture, and Henry and Ben are the after picture, so that's what we've got here. Well, when I heard that Henry was speaking today, my first thought was, oh, man, I don't want to have to follow Henry Sobinay. Because, you don't have to be the funniest guy in the room, but you don't want to be the second funniest. And that's what I am today. So, guys, it's great to be here with you. I've respected both of you for a long time, and I welcome this opportunity to talk with you. And because you guys have worked on this issue for a long time, you know that we've been spinning our wheels in Colorado for a long time. I mean, and now look at us. Are we building a dam after the creek ran dry?
Well, you can take the funniest prize now, Joey. Thank you for the introduction. My take is we're behind, but I think doing nothing would make it worse than it is now, would be the bottom line up front. I think when you look back at projects like the T-Rex project, that's probably most familiar to everybody listening if you've lived here or know about it. The bonds for that were issued in 1999. And, all the award ceremonies and handshakes and good jobs were happening in about 2005, 2006. So that gives you an idea of the amount of time it takes to get from A to B.
And remember, we didn't have the bonds paid off to pay for it until 2016.
Yeah, the financing took longer, but we missed some inflation.
Sure.
And we got the project done quicker. We got
Absolutely.
to use it sooner.
It's great.
And so there's trade-offs with bonding. But I guess the point is 10 years isn't a very long time in transportation. And the sooner you start, the sooner you'll have the capacity that you wanted when you started.
Henry, you talked about the status quo. And, I'm from that conservative camp that believes the status quo gets a bad rap, because the status quo doesn't become the status quo because it doesn't work. I mean, what's working about the system that we have now, and what needs to change? And what are the drivers of the status quo? How did we get here?
Well, what's working is we have a pretty accountable system of the user fees going where they're supposed to. The Colorado Constitution protects the gas tax to only be used for construction, supervision, and operation of the highway system. I think we have a non-political process of picking projects and executing with the appointed Colorado Transportation Commission process. And then I'll let Ben talk about, the financing and how that's changed over time and why we think the status quo is a little bit just going to take us backwards.
Okay. So, Joey, to the point about the status quo, the problem is it's going to change whether we like it or not. The fact is, motor vehicles are becoming more fuel efficient. As they become more fuel efficient, they pay less motor fuel tax per year. The fact that the tax is not keeping up with inflation doesn't make it status quo. That makes it actually probably regressive for the system. So if we can't keep, the status quo implies you are keeping up, and we are unable to keep up with a motor fuel tax that is fundamentally broken, not only because it doesn't adjust for inflation, but because vehicles are becoming more fuel efficient, not just motor vehicles fuels, but remember, electric vehicles, which are becoming more prevalent, don't pay any tax at all right now. So they are using the system without any contribution to it. The other thing that's changing the status quo, of course, is the system ages, whether we like it or not. The wear and tear on the system is a huge problem. You have to spend a lot of money just to fill the potholes every year. And that's a big deal. You have to have the roads designed to deal with traffic. And when you have all that, the status quo is not static. It is moving. And as long as our population is growing, which it is, and as long as all these things are happening, we have to make adjustments to the financing system for our highway system and, frankly, to the network itself in order to accommodate it and to maintain the status quo. Because the status quo is I get into my car at my home and I drive to work in 20 minutes. It ceases to be the status quo when I get in my car 5 years later and it's 45 minutes to get to work. That's no longer the status quo. So the status quo for us is really, can I still get to work in the time I did when I started living where I am and going where I'm going? Not how the system is financed. I know I went on, I kind of rambled there, but it's a complicated question about what is the status quo.
Well, I've
And
got
it's
a
not acceptable.
complicated question than that, because we can fix the roads, we can fix the budget, but can we fix the politics? Because that seems to be the roadblock. Anybody?
Yeah,
You know,
sure.
Bueller, anyone? Well, what we intended with the paper is we know about the politics. And we felt the contribution of the paper could be a better understanding of the issue at hand, meaning maintenance and capacity. Take a look at what the price tag might be, and then let that go into the public discourse. We very much didn't pick a way to fix it because automatically that becomes the target. And I think the tail of the tape with ballot issues in this state is you have to keep trying. If the last couple are one and done, we've laid out what we think happens in the paper. So it's probably not an unsurprising conclusion is our advice is to keep at it. But if we told people how to keep at it, then that becomes the target and we're back where we've been. That's our take on that, I think.
What about this pandemic? I mean, are there going to be economic lingering effects that are going to be a problem? I mean, is this a speed bump or is the bridge out?
That's a very good question, Joey. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. Because it may not be that black and white. It may be just different when it's done. As Henry alluded to when we were doing our presentation, many people may start working from home. How does that change the economy? We have, if people are no longer in large numbers going to downtown Central Core Denver, what happens to those entertainment districts, those restaurants? Are they viable anymore? I don't know. But on the other hand, are those same people still employed, still receiving a paycheck, and spending just as much money, just spending it somewhere else? That may be, so the outcome may not be that black or white. It may be something different. And regardless, there's going to be a time to adjust. And that's, again, why we need the reassessment phase.
Well, we try to think about this issue as a brief window, but this issue's been around a long time, and I'm not hearing quick solutions. So what do you mean brief window? Are you talking about the COP bonds, or are you talking about something else?
Oh, yeah, the relatively brief window is from now till about 2023. We've got 2 of the first 4 phases of the COP financing from Senate Bill 267 underway. Current law has 2 more, and those will be programmed through fiscal 23. We certainly hope the treatments or the vaccine gets settled before then. But between now and then, assessing how the revenues are doing, assessing do you want to do maintenance or capacity or both, assessing how many people are at the table who agree. 3 years is, I guess, for transportation, a short amount of time. It doesn't go fast, but if you think back right now to 2017, that's when the hospital provider fee passed, and we're halfway through that right now. So it goes medium fast, maybe.
But is it fair or even logical to say we're going to wait on the next thing before we spend this money? I mean, we've got potholes that need filling. We've got bridges that need to be fixed. We've got roads that need to be built. Can we wait on a high-speed rail? Oh,
well, I think we have to wait just for the moment, specifically right now. And we didn't really focus on this, but this last session was very hard to balance the budget. And so there's no new place to go get an infusion of money. In fact, Cdot's budget went a little bit backwards in this last budgeting just to shore up all the different revenue streams. So we didn't want to get into 1 or 2 years of plus or minus but I think that's one of the features of the status quo is if you're happy now, you'll get happier.
Well, Ben, can we wait? I mean, can we afford to wait on the problems that are in front of our nose?
Well, the trick to that is to understand what's waiting. As Henry's alluded to, in transportation is unique in Colorado, or in fact in public policy, because of the timelines involved with it. You know, a project can take 5 to 10 years from conception to construction. You need to keep moving. The other part of that is you need to have capacity to build it. You know, Cdot, I'm using Cdot here as my example, has been built to a very specific capacity for annual work. Now, do they contract a lot out? Yes, but they still have to manage all that. And the $500 million a year that they're getting right now is a significant plus up to their prior budgets. So they've had to plus up to do that. And they're doing that mostly without increasing their employee staff count. So there is a limit on how much work they can get out per year and how long it takes to get the work done. 500 million, now the maintenance work, the additional 300 million for maintenance, frankly, that's pretty simple to get out the door. But if you're talking capacity projects, and as you saw, we're talking maybe $500 million a year of those, if you want CDOT to maintain a steady state where it can effectively and efficiently work with our local industry partners, the design firms and the construction firms, stability of workflow is very important to that structure and keeping that work going and efficiently and effectively. So the answer is yes, you can't, it would be great if we could build everything today, but remember in 2009 when we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA, and they said shovel-ready projects? Well, those shovel-ready projects weren't all done in 2009. They went till about 2013 to get them all done. Construction takes a long time.
Yeah. Well,
so you might as well you need to get started.
Let me wade back into politics and talk about the elephant in the room. You know, there's always the question of why we can't use general fund budget money to pay for roads and bridges in Colorado. I mean, after food and water and education, I don't know of a need that's greater. I mean, education runs through our lives one way or the other. It's an essential part of how we function economically and just to live our lives. So why can't we get some general fund money into transportation other than politics?
Henry, you want to take this is a major part. This is a major section of the paper. If people read the large document, by the way.
We anticipated your question, Mr. Bunch, and so there is a section in the paper. I actually don't think it's just politics. It's also our Constitution, which is mandating growth in spending and reducing the revenue available for it simultaneously. I know every business person listening today, that's how they run their business, and that's in our Constitution. We've had 3 recessions over 20 years that has really reduced the purchasing power of the general fund per capita. And we've had basically 20 years, the biggest tax policies in the general fund have been tax cuts. If you just take the top 4 of the last 20 years, the income tax cut, the sales tax cut, senior homestead exemption, earned income tax credit, in 1819, those were all combined $1 billion of revenue for tax cuts, about 8% of the general fund. So it's really, you know, it's a very powerful talking point. Why don't you just prioritize your budget? Well, the voters did prioritize our budget. They prioritized property tax reductions and growth in K-12 schools. And then you deal with a couple recessions and pay for Medicaid and public safety, and you've got your general fund budget. The other thing is, over 20 years or so, there's been about $2.5 billion from the general fund given to transportation. And with the COP financing, once the recession's over, that's a long-term 20-plus year commitment to transportation. That was the skin in the game conversation from 2 or 3 years ago before we raised taxes. So the skin in the game got put in there. It's convenient to forget about it, but we can't, because it's a big budget item that's programmed annually.
Well, Kristen, did you want to go to some audience questions? Because all my questions are dumb from here on out.
Well, thank you for leading us in that discussion, Joey. It was wonderful. You both are both experts, so we really appreciate it. We do have a lot of questions from the audience, so I wanted to make sure we had ample time to answer those. I am just going to read through them, and Ben and Henry, I'll let you decide who might be best to answer. The first question, if we look at the logic about moving from horse to car, is it possible the future of transportation will be more working from home and mass transit? Ben, do you want to take a shot at that?
Sure. First off, yes, there very likely will be more working from home. That stated, mass transits, and this is something we discuss in the paper, is an interesting area and topic that we've really not talked much about today. The fact is that mass transit here in Colorado is mostly a creature of the Front Range. And yes, about 85% of the population lives there, but we have an awful lot of state that lives outside of those areas, and those areas are not conducive to being well served by mass transit. The second is that we've had an interesting trend. In the last few years, while we have spent more and more money in the regional transportation district area on mass transit, because we've committed a 1%, since 2004, we have 1% of sales tax, a huge transportation investment going to RTD. RTD is, as you know, used that money to significantly increase the size and scope and quality of its system, including in particular the deployment of rail systems. Interesting enough, the net result is ridership on RTD before the pandemic was declining. And now RTD is facing a financial crisis of epic proportion, which we've all read about. They had a driver shortage. They've committed a huge amount of their annual sales tax revenues to the payment of debt to build out those rail systems. And frankly, commuter patterns may change, particularly because of this, and no longer necessarily align with where they've built their rail systems or their bus rapid transit systems. I can't, at the moment, say that mass transit as we have envisioned it in the future, in the past, is necessarily, with the changes in technology, going to be a solution of the future. Because we may not be moving people, you know, there used to be a joke that RTD stood for Ride to Denver. The system is essentially designed, and I'm going to be simplistic here, I realize that, to move commuters into Denver in the morning and out of Denver in the afternoon. And that's despite the fact that far more of the jobs in the metropolitan area are not in downtown Denver's core. So given that, and the fact that transit use was already declining, and RTD does not at the moment appear to have the resources to effectively figure out a new way of developing mass transit, I don't know if mass transit is going to be, as we know it today, will be a major part of the solution. There will be clearly some form of mass transit or public transit authority, whether it's accessory for the handicapped and the needy and for those low-income people or something else. I don't know. But mass transit's role as we move to new technologies may become problematic.
Henry, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Ben covered all the points from our discussion in the paper.
Okay, one question that kind of dovetails off of this discussion around new technology from the audience related to rural Colorado. Rural Colorado has had an added issues of distance and population. How do you see some of the new technology working in rural areas?
Well, that's a great question. I think it's tough to answer. I think we very much talk about the need for a network, and even though 80% of Colorado's GDP is generated along the Front Range, it doesn't happen without the full network. And I feel like the electric vehicle issue is affecting revenue, but it also could improve perhaps transportation issues. I think maintaining just the basic road pavement quality is one of the underlying issues for the outstate regions. I'll kick it over to Ben because I'm struggling to see a direct special relationship of technology to rural transportation.
So I'll give you two possibilities where technology could have a significant impact in rural Colorado. The first is as we move more and more away from internal combustion engines, the question becomes how much more drilling and extraction of natural gas and oil will occur in Colorado, which mostly occurs in rural areas. And when those wells are being drilled and fracked and then exploited, it's a tremendous burden upon the rural transportation system. Those roads are not meant to maintain that type of traffic, of heavy truck traffic that goes and does that. At the moment, there aren't any drilling rigs out. That means that there's less pressure. That's sort of good news, bad news, isn't it? On our rural road network. Technology may also have a significant impact on how we move agricultural products to and from the farm to market. So there is a possibility that we will have a significant change. We may very well see autonomous or connected vehicles moving large loads of agricultural products to their railheads or wherever they're going to go. However, that stated, it is likely that the transformations of the system will be, in rural Colorado, will lag those in urban areas, which is pretty standard for all technology. And as much as rural Colorado is sensitive to it, whether it was rural electrification, the cities were, it took a long time after the cities were electrified for the rural areas. Broadband right now was deployed in cities, and we're still struggling to get it out to the rural areas. And the reality is that probably it will take longer to move technology and significant technological change out to rural Colorado. It'll probably first take place in the urban areas.
So shifting the conversation now a little bit, I think that we've all heard rumors out of DC around different potential stimulus bills. A question from the audience: any realistic thought of significant federal infrastructure programs or funding in the years ahead?
That's a great question, and we've been following it throughout, and we were actually trying to figure out how long can we wait before we press print to see if something would happen in July. I can see Kristen smiling because we were trying her patience about that one lagging comment in the Word document. And it seems like they're still wrestling with what to do with the next round of stimulus and the debate around unemployment benefits or aid to states. There have been numerous federal panels about reforming the gas tax. You know, there's a federal gas tax, as everybody probably knows on the call today, on top of the state one, and that hasn't been adjusted in a couple of decades either. So with, you know, $4 trillion of borrowing just for the first part of the pandemic, now however many other trillion, there are people pushing for infrastructure to be in these next tranches because they put people to work, they have high multiplier, and then you have long-term benefit from the spending versus just current consumption. So I think it is possible, but the questioner put the word significant. I'm not sure we'll get enough federal money to close the gaps we're talking about.
So back to funding then, I think that that's what's lingering on everyone's minds. We know what's happened in the last several attempts at the ballot box. Are there other ideas out there that might work? I know a question being, are regional funding approaches to transportation infrastructure a viable long-term solution? Kind of dovetailing off of that, a question to the voters structured similarly to the Colorado Springs model that we saw, a tax increase with a list of projects and then a sunset. Would that work? So maybe answer those two.
Okay.
We do have a significant, we actually discussed those very issues in the paper, and we specifically addressed Colorado Springs and its success and the possibility of regional models. The answer is, simplistically, a regional model is viable, depending on what you consider viable, but it's certainly not optimal. And the reason it's not optimal, as we've alluded to, is that the network that serves urban areas, while it's critical within it for commuting and for moving goods and services within it, it really can't function without all those roadways outside those areas. And the fact is, you can't expect Morgan County or some of these other rural counties to actually maintain, for example, I-70 in eastern Colorado on the plains. Those rural counties have no population. They have no tax base. There's no way that they could ever effectively maintain out of their property tax or income or sales tax bases that portion of I-70. So you could certainly pass a model like Colorado Springs that may end up being an option that people choose. It's a suboptimal one, but it is viable, and it could result, as Colorado Springs did, in significant improvements within the urban area.
Henry, anything to add?
Sure. I think that idea about a list and maybe a sunsetted stream of money to pay for it, I think that's really worthy of consideration. When we started the project, we thought about getting another seventh pot that's dating our time in Colorado.
Good Lord.
Another statewide list. Let's get another statewide list to rally around. And Cdot's process basically generated that. And there was a lot of community and local input into that list. I think that list deserves a really hard look statewide to see if a subset of it could be worked on, and take 10 years and say, okay, 1 part maintenance, 1 part capacity, and let's see what people think. There's some questions in the chat about how do you do this even though the voters have said no. Well, we understand, and so one thing we advise is keep at it. We don't feel like there's fee structure available without a new enterprise being created. It's just going to crowd out the general fund coming back to pay for the obligations the state already has. The state learned that lesson with hospital provider fees. So fees under the current system without room to keep it doesn't make any sense. So most of the thought experiments take you back to needing a coalition and asking under the rules that we have for more money for an extended period of time. But I like that idea of a sunset and a list. But again, if we had put that out there as the one thing to do, we felt like that would have been the conversation as opposed to showing people the imperative behind it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think Joey was getting at, this with his questions as well. We've tried to get people on board to fund different, the transportation system via various ways. One of the questions from the attendees, he said, I've been in the transportation business for 30 years. I've seen a lot of different ways that we've tried to skin this cat. But I guess, how do we get people to want to fund the system? They won't until they feel some pain, and each person feels different levels of pain, which leads to my last question. How do you address the vast diversity of the state? Not everyone lives on the Front Range, which we've discussed a little bit.
Hi, Mr. Olson. Nice to see your name there. Well, if we had the fix of how to persuade people, maybe we wouldn't have needed the paper. So I think that remains to be seen. There's an idea out there in communications called persuasion, where you just set up a conversation before anything's happening. And it's expensive, and it's hard to get people to front resources to do persuasion. People interested enough in transportation to come into our call today. Probably this group we could crowdsource something in the next hour, which we don't have. But taking it wider, people feel like their pocketbooks are already under pressure. The roads that they drive appear fine. They can't see the decaying roadbed underneath, and they don't know that it's 5 or 6 times the expense to dig it up and redo it as opposed to just do the overlay. So there's probably a baseline of understanding that's too low with the average person. If you spend 25 years on tax policy, this is as obvious as anything. But I know from just personal chats with friends who are professionals, they do things, they've accomplished a lot. That to them it's just, well, I don't want to pay more. So I don't think there's enough core understanding of the basic shortfall. That's my personal take.
And was that a goal of this paper? I know that, if you read the full paper, which I encourage you all to do on our website, commonsenseinstitute.co.org, there's a lot of great information, but it seemed like a lot of what the work that you both did was really to educate and inform Coloradans just on the overall problem.
I hope our contribution that's that helps the most is probably separating the maintenance gap from the capacity gap, and just showing how we've fallen behind from where we used to be and what we used to pay. It very much was a goal of the paper, and we hope that can be a good contribution to the dialogue.
Great. A few other questions. We still have more. We have about 5 minutes remaining in this webinar. If we don't get to your question, I'm sure that Ben or Henry would follow up with you as well. A few maybe you can answer real quickly. How well are the hot lanes contributing? Ben, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. Well, I guess the real question with the hot lanes is, I'm not quite sure what the word contributing means. And it varies from, and frankly, if it's how much money are they generating and how are they doing, it varies from lane to lane. The one that is most prominent, of course, is the Boulder Turnpike US 36, where in return for a concession agreement, a huge portion of that road was built, and they're contributing toward the maintenance of that road. HOT lanes have limited capacity for revenue gathering because they can only work when the road is congested on the other lanes. If the road's not congested in the other lanes, people don't use them. So it depends. So another example is, as you know, we're building the Central 70 and we're going to put some express toll lanes on there. The projections for that show that that particular lane is probably only going to really raise enough money to pay to maintain the lane, at least in the initial years. And again, the danger of going to, depending heavily on HOT type lanes is they only work in areas of high congestion and inconvenience to the people who are in the other lanes, because that's when you can raise revenue from them.
Anything to add, Henry?
Nope, good answer.
Okay, there is currently on the table an opportunity for the 8 local owners of the E470 asset to generate private funding of approximately $4 billion for transportation improvements, thousands of new jobs with taxes or fees. Why shouldn't this kind of idea be more seriously considered moving forward?
I'll take that one. I got an email about that a few days ago. It might be the same person. So the idea of selling E470 or getting an operating agreement has been out there for a while. And at the core, that's just a way of financing transportation. There's probably an internal cost of capital in a proposal like that. And we didn't pick the way to pay for stuff in every scenario. So if bonding, or essentially turning over a revenue stream to a private partner is the preferred choice, that's a form of bonding. And I think it just needs a cost benefit analysis to other forms of financing.
Great. Related somewhat, just thinking about different strategic partnerships that the state might explore. Aldous Sides asks, counties have their own funds and often federal grants. Some amazing projects have come to fruition recently at the county level. Question is, do you see partnerships with counties in your overall picture to strengthen resources available and creative ways to contribute to the web of our transportation master plan?
The short answer to that is yes, and it's been going on all along. You know, when T-Rex was built, the counties that were down there did have to put in money for it. The question is, how much can the counties put in, and when can they put it in? You know, Dolores County out in rural Colorado isn't exactly flush. Douglas County, on the other hand, has some money, and it puts money in. So, for example, the current C470 project that's just coming to completion now, Douglas County put a lot of money into that project, and that was key to getting that project over the top. Other projects are also being done. The I-70 Piccadilly interchange that's about to be built out in Aurora is local money with a federal grant. So, of course, absolutely, locals are important, but locals' funding sources for transportation are generally out of their general funds, which are also somewhat under pressure from their property tax base. And if you really want to take the next hour, which Henry said we don't have, we would be happy to talk about the Gallagher Amendment and what it means for property taxes.
That's the next webinar. One other question, what type of set-asides are allocated for TDM or Vision Zero? Other states and cities have instituted trip reduction mandates on employers or consistently have voted to tax themselves to improve their transportation networks, reduce congestion, improve air quality. How can we convince Colorado voters to place more value?
Well, again, great question. And obviously that's an underlying theme that came up today. I'll take the last part. Ben knows more about the first part than I do. Well, the mission of the Common Sense Institute is to put facts out there and frame out the issues. And we need everybody's advice listening today to, if you found the information useful and understandable, is, we need more creative minds to understand how to socialize and get the baseline situation out there and understood better. So we need everybody's help, I guess, would be my answer to that. And then I agree about the other states issue. 31 out of 50 states have reformed their gas tax or sales tax for transportation. They just have a lower standard of getting it done, probably through their state legislatures than we do. So that's why more information, better information, helps us clear those higher hurdles is the thinking.
Ben, any additional thoughts on
Sure.
that?
So to the travel demand TDM portion of it, if you want voters to vote for something, they're not going to vote for TDM, is my personal belief. Denver is in the process, as we know, of what they call a lane diet, where they're actually going to, in many instances, decrease the capacity for privately owned vehicles to maneuver in and out of Denver and the city. There are a lot of good things that are coming from that: better lanes for transit, better lanes for bikes, better lane, safer for pedestrians. But coercing people by making driving painful to get them into mass transit is not necessarily a vote getter.
Got it. So we are now over the time, but we do have one final question, and I think it's the big elephant in the room. We are in the middle of a pandemic. You both spoke in your presentation about the potential changes resulting that we've seen from transportation: less people on the roads, more people working from home. Carla Perez asks, we've seen amazing success in teleworking, and it's reduced the congestion in our systems. How do we take that experience into consideration as we think towards the future social behavior of commuters moving forward? And with that, I'd also like to just have you include any final thoughts as well.
Thank you, Carla. Well, that's a big part of our phase 1 recommendation. We do need to understand what permanent loss of revenue has happened and maybe what drop in travel demand has happened, and get the financing system at least modernized so everybody's paying as fair amount as possible. And that's a big, I don't know, or we don't know yet, how the travel demand is permanently affected. I will say one piece on that. We're so far behind on just regular maintenance. I'm not sure that 300 million comes down by very much based on that issue. The choices of which projects you might do out of the 3.2 billion list, those might change. My final thoughts are just, Terry J. Stevinson deserves a lot of thanks for sponsoring the project. Kristen, you and Chris at the Institute, amazing support and thought leadership and for me and Ben, and working with my friend Ben has been amazing. Joey Bunch, you win the humor prize. Thank you. And I appreciate everyone who dialed in today. Thank you very much.
Ben, any last words?
Just thank you for this incredible opportunity, and I hope that people will actually download and read the whole paper, because it took us a long time to write the thing.
You can find it at our website, www.commonsenseinstituteco.org. In the coming days, you might see Ben or Henry on TV as well. Henry was featured on Channel 7 this morning. Make sure to tune in. I'm sure that I'm hoping Joey might write a little article on it as well with Colorado politics. But thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate your time today. And please follow us on social media platforms to stay abreast of the top public policy issues facing you today. Thank you so much.